Okay, so I want to just go over some of the highlights of non-traditional grading systems. They've become much more popular during the pandemic as there have been increased concerns about equity, motivation, and other circumstances. And one of the factors behind them is, just if we think about what we enjoy most about teaching, very few people would put grading up at the top of the scale. But if we ask people what they enjoy least, I think grading would probably be one of the least enjoyable aspects, one of the most stressful. And we spend a lot of time on that. And if we flip that around to students, I wanted to have people discuss this a bit more, but I think the other things will be a little more useful for that. One of the questions that come up is, how do grades affect students' interests and motivation? There's been quite a bit of research with mixed results on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And certainly when things have intrinsic motivation, it tends to get people more actively engaged in them. Extrinsic motivation, though, does have a role. Some of the early studies suggested that extrinsic motivation had very little impact, but more recent work suggests that both are important, and grades are certainly a form of extrinsic motivation. But I think maybe the more fundamental question is, do we want students focusing on getting the highest grades in their classes, or do we want them to focus on learning? And the two often don't go together. And if we think about what students do when they're in their classes, there's a lot of metacognitive illusion going on, either metacognitive illusion or perhaps a focus that's different than what we'd like. We know, for example, that space practice or space practice and interleave practice are very effective in increasing long-term learning, but they don't have much of an immediate payoff. But what students actually tend to do is they tend to cram. They tend to read things over and over again right before they're going to be tested on them. And that tends to result in really good short-term effects in terms of getting higher grades on tests, but virtually everything tends to be forgotten very quickly. And that's optimal for students who are striving to get the highest grade. It's not so optimal in terms of providing as much learning perhaps as we'd like, or perhaps even as students would like. Presumably, they like to take something away from college other than the fact that they've gotten high scores on exams on material that they don't remember much later. So much of the focus on non-traditional grading has been an attempt to shift the focus away from a focus on achieving the highest grades in class to a focus on learning. And what we do know is that providing feedback to students is very important for learning, but grading is not as important. That, in fact, grading is a relatively recent historical phenomenon. It only started to show up actually, there was I think Yale introduced a grading scale with Latin terms back in the 1780s or so, but that didn't catch on very broadly. But Harvard introduced some numeric grades on a 100-point scale in 1837 in math and philosophy departments, and Yale introduced a 4.0 scale in 1813, and they spread pretty much everywhere after that. So that's where we are now, but for much of human history, we didn't really assign grades in colleges and universities and so forth. So I want to just go over some broad approaches. The simplest modification of grading is to do a form of mastery learning. And this is really common in the STEM disciplines. And basically what you do is you just give students either a limited or an unlimited number of opportunities to demonstrate mastery of concepts. And you only keep the highest grade. So basically you require students to keep working on something until they master it before they move on to the next topic. And that's pretty easy to do in some disciplines. It's a very common approach in math and in STEM disciplines when it's possible to generate algorithmic questions or other questions that students can be faced with the same type of problems repeatedly, and they can practice it, they can learn to master it. And that works really well when it's graded by a computer. It doesn't work quite as well if there's humans that have to do this. And It doesn't work quite as well in humanity fields or social science fields where there isn't the same capability for automatically generated questions. This is an approach that's also used, by the way, with adaptive learning systems, where the computer is basically providing students with more questions and more learning support on concepts that are fairly well defined that can be tested automatically. It doesn't work as well in other disciplines, especially where you have to grade all that work that students are doing. The people who, I forgot who said this, but there's a fairly famous quote that suggests that whoever is doing most of the work in higher ed is doing most of the learning. And the goal is to have students do more of the work and perhaps us doing a little bit less of that work. So mastery learning approaches are very productive, and there's quite a bit of evidence that they can work effectively in the sciences and math and similar disciplines. But it doesn't work quite as easily in other disciplines. The benefit is students are focusing their study efforts on the areas where they don't understand it as much, and they're able to breeze through the areas that they have mastered more easily. And it's automatically building in retrieval practice so that students are practicing things over and over again until they've mastered them. But I wanted to mention that simply because in STEM disciplines, that's probably the easiest switch to allow students to provide a more equitable environment for students so that they're not just faced with high stakes exams where they either pass it or fail it. And if they fail it, they end up giving up quite often. And that's one of the reasons why we see so much attrition in STEM fields and so many people switching majors out of the STEM fields. What I want to focus on a little bit are some of the newer alternatives. Some of them go back a ways, but one approach, which was developed by Linda Nielsen, is called specifications grading. Has anyone worked with that or tried specifications grading? Okay, so she also calls it specs grading, which is another term that's used for it. The basic approach here is to shift away from that stress that we feel when we're trying to determine whether someone's work is an A or an A minus or a B plus, or whether they just cross the threshold for that C minus, or whether they drop below it and so forth. And also to shift some of the focus away from students trying to get the highest grade they can, perhaps with as little effort as they can. So the goal with specs grading is you create very clearly defined assignments with very clearly specified objectives in terms of what students have to demonstrate on each assignment. It could be in the form of a rubric, it could be just a description of this, but if it's specified in a rubric, specifications grading uses a really simple rubric where every component, where basically the rubric is pass or fail. There's no gradation within it. So you don't have to struggle whether this is worth 3 out of 5 points or 4 out of 5 points. They either achieved that threshold or they didn't. So you specify what they have to be able to demonstrate, and then basically students submit the work and you give them a grade. They either achieved it or they didn't. So everything in the class, in a purely specs grading class, is a pass-fail assignment. They either achieve the goal or they don't. And typically what happens is that multiple attempts are allowed on some or all of those. How people implement that vary. Linda Nielsen herself only allows students a certain number of reattempts on things, where she has basically these tokens that they can use to take something over again. And there's a certain number of them that they can use over the course of the semester. And the goal there is to reduce the instructor's effort in terms of having to regrade work, and also to encourage students to put in their best work on each of the projects that they do. Other people allow multiple attempts and basically encourage people to keep doing things until they master it. And that's something that varies by instructor and also by how many assignments there are and so forth. And then the grade in the class isn't based on necessarily the grade they received on, or any score on any individual assignment. It's basically how many assignments they've completed, how many assignments they've met the specifications on. If they meet fully all the specifications on all the assignments, they get an A. If they meet specifications up to a certain number of assignments, they get a B. If they meet another threshold, they get a C. So basically what happens is all you have to evaluate when students turn in work is, did they meet these specifications or did they not? And if they didn't, you give them some opportunity perhaps to go back and learn from that and try again. And this takes a lot of the effort over deciding where the thresholds is. And it also provides fairly clear standards and objectives to students so that they know exactly what you're asking of them. Because one of the things that often happens when students are first faced with tests or graded assessments is they spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the instructor wants, because while it's perfectly clear to us what we want, it's not always so clear to the students. So the first time they take a test or the first time they turn in an assignment, they really don't know how they're going to be evaluated. And they get better at that over time. So for the instructor, more of the work is put on making the instructions very explicit in terms of what you expect. You spend less time grading, but you spend more time clearly defining what the specifications are. Now, another way of doing this is, instead of giving a grade based on the number of assignments, you could have different levels of specification, so that students at the beginning of the class say, I want an A, and then you have a list of specifications or requirements for A-level work. And then you have a different list of requirements for B-level work. You have still a different one for C-level work. And so if students are content with the C, they just need to meet that level of work, or that you have different specifications at each level, which is similar to a contract grading type system. But basically, you tell them up front what is required to get an A, what's required for a B, and then they know exactly what those specifications are, and then they can track that over the semester. Does that make some sense? I haven't used it. It's something I'm really tempted to use, and I'm tempted to use it in my upper level, in at least one of my upper level classes next semester, but it's been used, many people have used it. Rebecca has used it in some of her classes, and students didn't always react quite as well because they did have some issues in meeting those specifications. And that meant, instead of getting, say, a B or something similar on the work, they were told basically, this doesn't quite meet the criteria. You have to go back and do it again. And that can be discouraging. And some students, she said, were starting to give up. So she had to modify it a little bit. Maureen.
I think it's funny because when I hear you describe it and I see this, it just sort of feels like it's sort of like moving things around more than anything. Like the specifications, as you say, it's like instead of grading after the fact, you're up front with the specifications, which makes sense to me. I certainly see the value of it, but I'm a little puzzled about the idea that, that they, in the end, you would grade them on what they had, where they had achieved mastery. I mean, I've actually taught a class where students really work on a single project across the semester, and they sort of do that in stages, but many of them don't even really want to redo things. And so I think I'm really struggling with this because I'm teaching a pass-fail class, and they neither seem particularly invested in the rewrite to get to mastery, nor are they all that interested in, well, I guess that's what I would say, that I don't know. I'm really struggling. I want to do this and I want to make it work, but I don't really feel like it's happening.
And for some people, it hasn't worked. It may work better in some disciplines than others. And I remember when I was a student, when I was always given the opportunity of turning in a draft of a paper and getting feedback, I never once did that. And that would not have worked very well with this type of a system. I always just turned it in when it was due. If it was due at midnight, I'd be sliding it under the professor's office door at midnight. And and that may not work as well, or it might force people to go to that process of going through revisions, but not everyone is going to do that. And I know people don't like to redo their work, that they submit something which they think is high quality work, and then when they're told it doesn't meet the standard, that could be a little bit more troubling than, than getting a fail on it, where they have to go back and completely redo it. It would have to be sold to students that, you do need to, you learn through making mistakes and making revisions. And that's something that not all students are used to, that often up to this point, they often had not had to do that. And that can be challenging.
Right.
So,
I think I was just going to say, in some ways, this model doubles down on the commonly held idea that with enough effort, a high grade should result. And sometimes it's not really a function of effort, right? So I just know that that's where I think the students get frustrated, because they feel like, well, I'm trying, and I understand that frustration. So thank you.
and yeah, no, that is an issue. And then there's other approaches that may be seen as being more equitable, because our students do come in with some really dramatic differences in their background. That was always true, but it's especially more true now as we've gone through the pandemic, as we have a more diverse student body with more students coming in from schools that do not have the same quality of instruction as many of the students who came in the past. And as all of our students have been coming in after having learned remotely during a pandemic, with the quality of the instruction and the amount of work that they've had to do has varied dramatically. Some schools still provided fairly high quality instruction over the last 5 semesters. Others, high schools and so forth, provided very little instruction. And so our students are coming in with really different backgrounds, where some of them are starting at a starting point which is much different than many of our other students. Some come in with a really strong background, others come in with less. And that would be a little bit harder here to implement that, because of that reason, that students with a weaker background would have to do a lot more work. And that's going to be true with pretty much any grading system. If we want to, the students who come in with less background, in general, unless you're going to do something that's entirely a labor-based grading system, and we'll talk about that a little bit, is going to be the case that if a student comes in very well prepared, they're going to be able to breeze through many of our classes without a lot of effort. Students who have a weaker background, if they want to achieve the same level of achievement, are going to have to do more work one way or another. And that often involves imposing a lot more work on students from lower incomes, from backgrounds where they haven't had to do as much work in their educational system because they were not being prepared for college level work. And it's a challenge. And we don't want those students, we don't want to lose those students along the way. And so, specifications grading doesn't work for everyone. I think Linda Nielsen, when she developed this, was it Drexel? I don't remember where she was at the time, but it was a fairly high quality private institution with a fairly selective student body. And it may work better in an environment where students came from very competitive academic backgrounds and were used to having to work harder to get higher quality work, maybe. I'm not sure. But one possibility is doing this with some assignments. And if you do have a major project in the semester, you could always do this as you're building up to that final project. And it could be something as just simple as, you're ready to go to the next stage. So, by putting in, essentially, instead of giving students grades, you could just say, yes, you're ready to move on to the next stage of this project, and giving them feedback to help them get to that. So that could be a lower stakes way of doing that, where then you can make adjustments as you move to higher levels. If the assignments are scaffolded well from early, less threatening stages, and you give students feedback and keep them on track all the way through, they won't face the same level of problems if they just have higher stakes assignments. And this could be done just on those earlier stages. So you're not quite, your outline is not quite ready for the next stage. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a dramatic amount of new work, but they could be getting some gentle nudges to keep them on track along the way. And this type of grading system could be used that way, or it could be just simply a light grading system, which we'll talk about just a little bit, where either they get a check mark or a check minus or something similar, maybe a check plus if you want to make it more elaborate. So this may not work for everyone, but it's one approach that more and more people are at least considering. And I've thought about it for my senior capstone class particularly, but they're senior majors where, you know, they I think would be more ready for this than students who are freshmen or sophomores even, but I'm not sure. Another similar approach in some ways. Well, first, any other questions or comments or reactions? The reason I'm looking to the side is I got everyone's faces over on my other monitor.
John, I was going to say, actually, when you were talking about, you know, that some of these gradings, these systems are good for like STEM and not for others. I didn't realize what I was doing was the specification one, because I work so project-based, and because the students I get, because what I teach is so non-traditional, that I can't go with, well, if you want an A or a B, because I'll have the kids just stopping at, okay, I'll settle for a B or a C, or I don't care, just pass me. But we also have the problem of not only COVID, but what they're teaching in school and what they've done away with has drastically changed from when I started working here, teaching what I teach, to now. I mean, home ec is not even a thing anymore, sewing. And I have tech ed students and secondary ed students coming to me so they can learn to teach what's it called, home and career sciences, whatever it is. And they come in as seniors and I can't teach them what they need. So grading them to get to the point they need to be has to be, it's to the point where it's all independent study classes, and we have to do the specification grading. But I think I'm speaking too soon because I'm looking at labor-based grading. And have you explained that?
I'm lumping two things together because they overlap quite a bit. So yeah, certainly students are coming with a different background. My students don't even know how to use a slide rule anymore, which I had to do at one point. How can you teach logs without them knowing how to use a slide? Well, I'm kidding, but I had a calculator when I was in high school, but I did have a slide rule too. So contract grading, this has been around for an awfully long time. And basically, the student and instructor agree to a contract in which each grade is tied to a specified set of criteria, which often includes a broad set of things, which could be how many times they've been absent. I have never graded on this basis, but many people do. So that in order to get a grade of A, you can't have more than 3 absences, for example, or you have to turn in a certain, certain number of drafts on papers is required to get an A, or a certain number of papers, or a certain number of reading reflections, or something similar. So you can just specify that if you do all of these things, you know, and it may or may not be at a given acceptable level, because it could be just based on the number of things that you've done. And when it moves entirely to a quantitative measure, then it becomes basically labor-based grading, that you're giving grades to students based on how much they do. Most instructors, though, will also put in some type of a minimum quality standard on those things. So it's a continuum, and that continuum varies quite a bit across instructors, across classes. And that's something that you have to be very clear with students. You know, if there is a minimum level of quality that is acceptable, you have to convey that to them, and then it moves closer to being a specs grading type model. But a pure labor-based grading model is just, if you do this many things, if you write this many reflections, if you do this many things, you're going to get an A. If you only do this many, you get an A minus or a B plus or a B or a B minus or something similar. So, by doing that, students no longer are worried so much about what their grade is. They know exactly how much they have to do, and they don't have to worry as much about how the instructor is going to evaluate it. As long as they do a certain number of things, then they get a passing grade. So, that this is not uncommon in some humanities disciplines and so forth, but it tends not to be used. People in the STEM disciplines tend to be much more concerned about this because they are concerned about the content mastery in some sense. Maureen.
I'm wondering, this is interesting to me. I'm wondering though, how it translates easily to an LMS, right? It seems like you're kind of having to tailor each student's grade system, right? Is that, and I don't compute that part.
Well, one thing you could do is if you use a points-based grading system, you give them a certain number of points for each thing. So either they get the points for completing it. It could be just simply 1 point for each item that they complete, and then they get a certain grade if they accumulate a certain number of points.
Got it.
So, it's not a percentage. It's just, if you do this many things, you get an A. If you do this many things, you get an A minus, and a points-based grading system would allow you to do that.
So it's a single system, and then they kind of fall where they fall within it based on that grade that you
pre-specified it. So
Right.
they know exactly what they need
Right.
to do.
Thank you.
And then it's just a question of getting all the things done by the end of the term. And
Right.
you could, at midterm, you could say, this is how much you could even set goals to be on track. You should have completed this many things by this date. You should complete this many by the following week, or this many by the following checkpoint, so that students know where they stand relative to the overall course grade. Students do tend to procrastinate. So, having some checkpoints on that would be really helpful. And often these great alternative grading systems also involve students meeting with the instructor and discussing their progress, or doing some type of a blog or a log or a journal describing what they're learning and what their progress is. And that moves more fully into an ungrading system, which has really become very popular in the last few years. So does that make some sense? Again, contract grading and labor-based grading are technically different, but it's on a continuum where contract grading could be anywhere from specs grading, if you have minimum standards on everything, to a purely labor-based grading where you basically just have to do a certain number of things. But again, even there, I don't think any instructor would accept something of extremely low quality as working towards it. So there's always some threshold of minimum quality that's required to meet the contract. And Josh Eiler, who was on a podcast with us a couple of weeks ago, actually noted that he uses an ungrading system, but he builds in an aspect of contract grading where he said, these are that basically the grade is negotiated between the instructor and the student with an ungrading model. But in order to be able to get a grade higher than a C, you must attend at least this many classes. You must complete at least this many assignments. So basically the grade is essentially negotiated and based on reflection and discussion, but there are minimum standards, essentially a minimum contract you have to meet in order to be able to get a grade above a C. And that, again, takes some of the pressure off. So you could use this type of thing just to say, these are the minimum things you need to do to get a C. If you do all these things, you're guaranteed a C, and you don't have to worry about not passing this course in some way. So, you can combine different aspects or different alternative grading approaches, and they can even be for different components of the class. You could still combine some traditional tests or some traditional paper assignments with other grading systems that are a little bit lighter, that are a little bit lower stakes, or a little bit more flexible in your courses. So does that make sense? Okay, now ungrading, which is really where much of the discussion has turned recently. And the goal here is to shift the focus of the class entirely away from trying to get the highest grades and so forth, and to shift the focus entirely on learning. You have to specify very clearly what the learning objectives are for the class, what you want students to achieve. And then you have students continually self-assessing their progress towards that as you move through all the work in the term. That could involve having students write blogs, or they could be journaling and sharing the journals with you, where they're describing what they learned, what their progress is, what they've learned from that, how their approach to learning has evolved, whether they're meeting their goals, whether they're struggling along the way, and providing them with feedback as they do that. And then, in general, even if you're using an ungrading model, you still have to assign grades at midterms and final at the very least. But presumably you're providing students with feedback at every aspect of this. So they'd still write drafts and you give them feedback, but the feedback would not have a grade. It would just say, you could improve your work in this area by doing this, or have you considered adding this, or considered reflecting a little bit more about this aspect of the project, or whatever it is you're working on. And then what typically happens when people are using ungrading is that students will submit based on their achievement of the learning objectives, either to the midterm or at the final, they will submit a grade that they think they've earned and explain why. They'll talk about what they've learned, how much they've learned, where they've made progress, how their learning and their approach to the discipline has evolved and changed. And then you meet with the students individually, and then they discuss the grade. And for those of us who haven't tried this, or at least not tried this yet, many people are concerned that students would tend to inflate their grades. Everyone I know who practices this approach says the opposite comment is more typical, where students will often understate the level of achievement compared to what the instructor perceives a student work is. And that's particularly true for female students, and particularly true for students from minoritized groups. And the argument basically there is that stereotype threat may be interfering with the student's perception of the work. And everyone I've talked, and with the podcast, we've talked to a lot of people who've moved to an ungrading approach. They said the more common response that they've had when they've talked to the students during these meetings is telling students that they're actually doing better than they thought they were, that their work is actually at a higher level than they perceived it themselves. They all mention that occasionally they get that Dunning-Kruger effect, or they get students who are just hoping that they can get away with saying that they really deserve a higher grade. But what they've all said is that when they sit down with students who've done very little in the work, they've not turned in a lot of assignments, or they submitted some really low quality work, they'll generally sit down with them and just say, now, let's think a little bit about that. You missed this many classes. You only turned in half of the assignments that you were supposed to. Do you really think that's worth an A or an A-? And then what they say is that they always will back down, that they may try, a few students will try to get away with that, but everyone I've talked to who's done this, mostly in the humanities, mostly in history and writing classes, but they said it's much more common for students to underestimate the quality of the work, and for those negotiations to actually raise a grade above the grade that the student suggested. So that's an ungrading approach, and I haven't tried it, and I'm seriously thinking of trying this approach, either this or a specs grading. The people who've done this have generally said they would never go back to not using ungrading, because they say it changes student motivation. It changes the dynamic in the class. It makes it clear that you're not there just to evaluate students, but to assist them in mastering the material. Because I know in my own classes, especially back when I first started teaching, and I was only giving 3 or 4 exams over the course of a semester, especially in large classes, students would be really engaged in the discussion. They'd be often quite excited about seeing some of the applications of economics they hadn't seen. And then they get that first exam back. and they see that their scores weren't quite as high as they thought. And then that discussion gradually died off a little bit. Then they get to the next exam. If they also didn't do that well on that next high stakes exam, a lot of students would disappear. And the students who would disappear would tend to be those students who really most needed to be there, who were struggling with the material the most. And, with this approach, that's no longer the same type of environment. It takes that sort of thing away, where it's very clear that you're there to help them achieve more. Now, I don't think I couldn't implement this in a class of 300 or 400, but I'm also not giving 3 or 4 tests anymore either. They have multiple graded assignments every week with lots of opportunities to redo things. So there are things you can do in other large classes, but in smaller classes, the ungrading approach might be worth considering. And it does provide a whole lot more flexibility to address some of those issues that you mentioned, Maureen, where students are coming in with very different backgrounds and so on, or Judy, that, you can still look at the value added compare the students from where they started to where they ended up and take that into account as well, perhaps. Thoughts, questions, or concerns?
I have a quick question. What is the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Oh, the Dunning-Kruger effect is that the people with the least understanding of the concept tend to systematically overestimate their understanding of the material. Because if you really don't know well, for example, have you noticed anyone who do their own research about viruses or about the pandemic, who say, well, I've done my own research and I think that, that horse dewormers is really the best way of curing this thing, which isn't really much different than the flu. And they're very confident in their understanding because they've seen it reinforced within their peer group, but they perhaps may not be experts at it. That one of the things I think that most of us have experienced is that the more we learn about our discipline, the more we understand just how much we don't really know. And students often, when they first start studying something, the students who understand the concepts the least will often have, and this has been backed up in many, many studies, that they will often perceive their level of understanding as significantly higher than it really is. While the people who really understand some of the complexities and the nuances of the discipline generally recognize that they don't understand it that well. And so people who understand things really well often will tend to underestimate how well they understand something, while those who have the least understanding tend to overestimate it. Does that make sense? One of our former presidents was often accused of perhaps being a classic example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where he was an expert on many things that he had no clue about. Maureen.
I was just going to say that one of the interesting things about teaching in a pass-fail course is that I actually think the challenges students have arise more from their jobs and their array of other obligations, excuse me, rather than sort of diverse backgrounds, because they've been on campus for a while, and when they report to me on the challenges they're experiencing, they tend to be these kinds of issues. And when they're confronted with a class where they get a grade, and where they're in person, those I think just feel more urgent. And so an ungraded class seems to fall down to the bottom of the priority. And I don't blame them, right? But I do need strategies, which is why this is great. I really like some of these procedures or mechanisms or approaches that you're outlining here. The fact that you haven't yet done it makes me a little nervous, because I sort of see you as the person who's.
Well, economics is one of those fields that borders on the STEM fields where we are concerned that they understand how to use the tools of the discipline. And an ungrading approach,
Yikes.
it's really easy to misunderstand a lot of key concepts. So, I have partly moved to some of these things. Yesterday, actually, you were at the session where I talked about the podcast project, and basically there, some of their misunderstandings become really clear when they're trying to use the concepts to explain things they observe in the news. And there I'm able to gently nudge them back and say, well, think back to this concept. And is that really what this analysis would predict would happen in this case? And that has worked pretty well, but it doesn't scale that well.
Yeah.
And I think ungrading in some ways is an unfortunate term because they still end up getting grades. And if students think that ungrading means that they don't get a grade for their work, they could very well be a disincentive, that they could very well shift it to their efforts to the grades where they can see how well they're doing. And one concern I have with a more ungrading approach is that students won't necessarily see how well they're doing until it may be too late for them to make a change. So you have to be giving them feedback and saying, you need to work more on this, that this is not quite, you're not quite at the level that you should be at this point in the class. So it's going to, an ungraded approach is not less work for the instructor. It's just somewhat different work. And it does require more persuasion than perhaps you would have to if they were seeing their grades, I think. So one of my concerns with moving to an ungraded approach is that it may require more effort. And I'm kind of tapped out much of the time these days. I don't know. Any other thoughts about ungrading? Well, one of the things I've done is I put together just a limited set of resources. And again, that relates to a time issue here. And let me just grab that URL. Let me pop out of there. If you want to, well, you can get it actually by just holding up your phone and with the camera on the QR code, or you can just pop it into here. And yes, I didn't look at the chat before, but yeah, that basically these do require that ungrading in practice pretty much always requires one-to-one meetings. And that is a lot of work, and it works better in smaller classes. Most of the people I know who use ungrading tend to be working with classes of between 25 and 30 students or 35 students, sometimes less. Now, one of the things I have in here is, as chair of the Fact 2 Council, one of the things I put together is a SUNY Fact 2 task group on innovations in student learning, innovative assessments of student learning. And there's some really good people on that task group who are doing some work. If you go to this website, they broke things. I'm on this group, but not an active member of it in practice, but they broke up innovations and assessment into some broad categories. One is social justice assessment. Judy Littlejohn from GCC is the chair of this group, and they're looking at labor-based grading, and contract grading, as well as ungrading. And they have some resources on each of these where you have they're assembling a list of resources this year. They started working on this last year. And they also have some examples of people in SUNY who are using social justice measures to try to provide more equitable grading systems. And there's a growing list of those resources. The next category, I was never entirely happy with the terms here. Real world assessments basically involves things like authentic assessment, where they're doing authentic work. Authentic assessment, lower level authentic assessment, educative assessment, which forward-looking assessment, and so forth. They come up with their own terms, but they do have some really good resources and some really good examples in here. So, you can look at some characteristics of authentic assessment systems. And again, this is being built, and they're working towards finishing their work this spring. And they're going to be doing a series of 4 webinars. Actually, it's a symposium broken up. It was going to be in person, that should the pandemic have been over, but now there's going to be 4 Thursdays in March where they're going to be doing a different webinar on each topic. One will be on social justice assessment. One will be on real world type assessment, authentic assessment systems, basically. And the other is on multiple, well, the third is on multiple pathways, and multiple pathways involves things like specs, actually specs grading and contract grading go here rather than any other grouping, gamification, and adaptive learning approaches. And there's another approach which we were kind of censored by some of the SUNY overlords for at least a while, which was focused on, yeah, well, we got our hands slapped a little bit by posting something that might have conflicted with the work of another group in SUNY. So it's been temporarily taken offline, but the other group was prior learning assessment, where people would be, where their prior learning would be assessed and used as a criteria within the class. But the SUNY Council on Assessment was doing some work, and they were troubled that there was some overlap between this and this. So they're working on making sure that there's no disagreement between these before that fourth component of this comes back online, and before we do that fourth webinar in March. But this group is doing some good work, and they will be presenting, by the way, at CIT. There'll be one presentation from the whole group, and then the social justice. Well, I'm assuming that if the presentations are approved, it's going through a review process now. The social justice group, which will handle much of the discussion of equity-based grading and ungrading, will be presenting separately because that's such an area of growth recently. So at least they've submitted proposals for that, and I think it'll probably happen. But going back to other resources there, I've got this control thing popping up here. You know, there's other links, mostly to, here's a simple document in EdSurge, actually an EdSurge podcast on mastery learning. That's been around for a while, and there are thousands of resources out there, but it's pretty straightforward. Linda Nielsen's book is really good on specs grading, but she also did a podcast with us a couple of years back where she describes it pretty well, very nicely. And then a couple of documents on contract and labor-based grading, one on each, and then ungrading. Much of that is, typo there, much of that is some documents. Jesse Stommel.
I hear what you said. Sorry, could you say that again?
My phone is saying something here. That basically, Jesse Stommel coined the term ungrading. And so his How to Ungrade document, which apparently I didn't put a link into, I will fix that, is a kind of a classic reference to this. Susan Bloom's text, where she's an editor along with, I forgot who A. Cohn was, but Susan Bloom really was a person who put most of this together. It's a collection of essays on ungrading from people in a variety of disciplines, including at least one person from math, which is an area where they haven't seen as much work. Lenny is someone who's working on equity and grading or equitable grading approaches. She is on the faculty at SUNY Potsdam, and she was on in December. Jesse Stommel was on where he mostly talked about ungrading on our podcast back in July. And Josh Eiler had a recent podcast where he talked about how he's been implementing this combination of contract grading and ungrading in his classes and his perception. He was also talking about a new book that he has coming out probably late spring or early summer on alternative grading systems and on the evolution of grading. So, and I will put in the link to Jesse Stommel's work right after this is over. So there are some additional resources if you like more, but there's a lot of people out there discussing it. And there's lots of blogs written by people who are doing ungrading or specs grading and so forth. But ungrading is certainly a very hot topic recently. So any questions, concerns, thoughts, reactions?
I just wanted to say thanks for this, John, and that it's interesting for me. So I teach poetry classes, and I think I've been doing elements of this, like for a good decade without knowing what I was doing, where I'm not doing it for the entire course, but maybe a third to even a half of what ends up being the final grade is what I've described to students as being completion-based grading.
Right.
And I think, and those things that are completion-based then also appear later in the final portfolio that is graded. And two things I've noticed is one, I've gotten better at setting up times where I talk with my students about the feedback I've given them on those poems, because I've realized without that, and not only do I talk with them, but I have an assignment where they are sort of paraphrase what I've said and bring that to office hours, and we talk through it and talk through things they didn't get feedback on that they might have wanted that on. And then the other thing is I've started like thinking back to Maureen's comment about students and revisions and like going back to things, is I'm sort of early in thinking about this, but noticing just the vast improvement between like the first poem a student submits and the 8th poem they submit. And I'm thinking of that also as a type of revision they're doing, where I think it's maybe a higher level skill, the 300 or 400 level class skill, where they figure out how to go back to that early poem and make it better. But the fact that they're taking the feedback they got on the early poem and the continued learning and doing so much better on the 8th poem, like I'm starting to read that as a version of the revision they're doing also when I look at their final portfolios. But I'm excited to look into more of these resources that you've shared. So really just wanted to say
yeah,
thanks.
and revision doesn't have to be on the same thing. It could be that status of getting better in doing it in different applications, which they're less likely to object to. But you could even ask them to reflect on, you know, how their final work compares to the work early on, so they can, it'll make it more obvious to them the progress that they've made over the course of the semester. And one thing, especially for those teaching online or remotely, Desire to Learn has some wonderful tools for built-in audio recording, audio feedback, and video feedback built right in. So instead of just providing text comments on students' work, you could embed short video comments or video reaction where they can hear the tone of voice, you know, if you want to, if you're teaching asynchronously. And that's a nice feature too. I mean, we could always do that now, but it's a little bit more cumbersome having to do it with an external tool and build it in.
Okay.
Other thoughts? Other things that people have tried that has aspects of this?
I have a question. I had to step out for a moment, but did light grading come up? You had mentioned that.
You know, I think I put it in there and I think I just kind of blew right by it. Light grading is basically, did I delete that? I had a slide in here with light grading, and my guess is I overtyped it. Basically, light grading is is a somewhat looser version of specs grading, where you just give them a check plus or something. I had a slide there. I swear I did. I created it earlier today. And I must have typed over it. But light grading is basically like a light version of specs grading, where you just, that sort of, yes, completion grading would be a form of that, where either they've done this or they haven't, or you might give them 5 points for doing it satisfactory, maybe 3 points or 4 points for not quite being there, just to give them a little feedback, letting them know that they've done this, but they could do it a little bit better, or there's something missing, you know, where they're not going to be penalized a lot. But light grading, I had a slide on that. I'm sorry. It probably became whatever the next slide after that was. It's been one of those years, but certainly one of those weeks. But yeah, light grading.
No problem. I was just curious. Thanks.
Have you done light grading?
I had a high school teacher who did, sort of, but that was my only experience so far.
It makes it easier for us, but it also just rewards students for making progress. That if they've submitted something, even if it needs more work, you know, you can give them a small amount of credit for that, as basically, as Laura suggested, just if they've completed it, you know, they get a check, they've got a completion on that. But you can still give them feedback and say, you're going to need to develop this a little bit more to get to the next stage. So they're not being penalized for not quite being there at this stage, but they're given a little bit of a nudge to move in a more productive direction.
I have a question. I think I'm really interested in what other people do in terms of doing that, sort of giving feedback on the multiple submissions, because I definitely am one of those people who grades. It's like a freight train. I do this set and then I move on to the next set and I can't go backwards. Going backwards just feels like I just I'm locked. I can't go backwards. I think it's because I'm afraid the train's just going to derail. So I'm interested to hear if other people have like some strategies for how you keep up with multiple efforts, right? That's the thing I think that is intimidating to me about this. So if people have strategies, I'd love to hear it.
So this wouldn't speak to multiple efforts that are like the students' total option to do or not do, but I basically have built in as like the next assignment deadline is here. So as I'm grading, I'm like, and now I got this batch in. And I've even done that when it's an optional resubmit, like your optional resubmit deadline for this is blank. And so then it's like, okay, I got that batch in, 12 students took that option, and now I have that batch to grade. Because I have a similar thing. I think if I had assignments just trickling in at any day, any week, as we're trying to organize so many things, I find that kind of becomes not a good use of my time. But yeah, batching resubmission has helped me.
Yeah, and we don't want all the work coming in a huge pile at the end of the term, as I've often had when I've allowed too much flexibility with that. One of the things, Josh, I asked Josh Eiler about that because he does have flexible deadlines. He has deadlines, but he calls them, and this is something that a lot of people doing ungrading do, they call it a best by date, sort of like, you know, milk or something like that. It's best if you get it by this date. After that, you know, you can consume it, but it's probably not going to kill you. But the way that sort of thing is going to be approached is the way he approaches that, and many people do, is if you really want good feedback on this to help you get to the next stage, get it in by this date. If you turn it in later, I will look at it, but I'm not going to be able to give you much feedback. So you'll assign a score. It might even be a little bit lower score, but you'll give them a score for completing it, but you're not going to give them the same level of feedback because the class has moved on to the next topic. And so doing that sort of thing and selling it that way, what he said is that even though he allows this, he said he's not really finding more requests for late work than he did back when he had more rigid deadlines. That most students were still turning in the work by the best by date, even though, you know, it was more flexible than he had been in the past. Now, I'd have to try that myself to be convinced that that's going to happen, but because I always get students asking about work that was due months before. And so, yeah, you have to be careful not to make this more work for you.
Thank you. I have to go. Have a great
Okay.
weekend, everybody. Thanks, John.
Okay, thanks. And if anyone tries this, let me know and let me know how it works, and you'd be good to present next time. Okay, well, I will stop the recording.
Thank you, John. You gave a lot of food for thought and things that I know I'm already doing, like everybody